Hello everyone, welcome back. Following up on the R9 270, we now have the R9 280, a hand-me-down card from my brother. Much like all GCN era cards from AMD, the R9 280 has a previous name in the HD 7000 series, the HD 7950. It is worth, however, mentioning that the rendering configuration has been later reused in two more cards, the GCN2 R9 380 and GCN3 R9 285. Speaking of said rendering configuration, all the details can be seen right now on the screen in the GPU-Z dialog. Alternatively, the previous video on the card, or the tech power-up entry, can be accessed using the links in the video description. I will not cover much of the cooling and thermals. Again, the previous video for this card has more details. I'll just mention that the values we got previously, those results still stand. A 53C delta over ambient had the card reaching 78C in heaven, while the values when playing Warframe are 1 degree higher. To test this card, I used the same Z230 workstation from HP, featuring an E3-1241v3 Xeon CPU, known as i7-4770 in the consumer market, paired with 32GB of DDR3 running in dual channel at 1600 MHz. We start off with Alien Isolation, which, unsurprisingly, runs very well at 1080 resolution and ultra settings, averaging almost 120 FPS. This is more than what's needed to run the single-player slower-paced game. The R9 280 is overkill for this, and the 1% loss of 77 FPS should drive this point across. Apex Legends enthusiasts will be happy to hear that the R9 280 will provide average frame rates in the mid-90s at 1080 resolution and low settings. The 1% loss of 62 makes the game quite playable. Players running the R9 280 can join the fray, and if they do need a higher FPS, then lowering the resolution will provide that. To be noted though, lowering the resolution to 720 won't double your frame rate, but will bring it around the 120 FPS mark. PUBG will end up keeping Paimon company for the same reason, lengthy updates for a game that I have no connection with. Having said that, I did test the R9 280 and it averaged 82 FPS at 1080 and low settings, which is quite adequate for this game. The 1% loss of 45 should not be much of a problem. Since I tested Battlefield 5 on 3 resolutions for the previous review, I thought I'd do the same for the R9 280. At 720 resolution and low settings, the card averages just shy of 90 FPS and provides 1% lows of mid-60s. 1600 by 900 is probably as high as this card would go in multiplayer, with 1% lows staying in the low 60s and averages reaching almost 80 FPS. As for the 1080 resolution, if you can stomach the 1% lows of 51, you can use that online as well. Otherwise, this last one is best kept for single player. At 131 FPS on average, control runs more than fine at 720 resolution and low settings. The 1% lows stay in the mid-80s, and that made me wonder, how well would it run at 1080? Well, 66 FPS for average and 40-41% lows. The game plays quite fine, and this would be the resolution to use with this graphics card. Rainbow Six Siege started to act a bit CPU bottleneck at 720 resolution and 50% render scale. The average of 206 FPS is just 21 more than at full render scale, and it's a better indicator than the CPU percentage usage. At 1080 and 100% render scale, the card averaged almost 120 FPS with 1% lows in the low 90s, so there is no problem running the game at these settings. I was afraid that GTA 5 would reach frame rates that would induce game engine related bugs. Fortunately, at 1080 and low settings, the card averaged 120 FPS with 1% lows of 68. I'd still add an FPS cap in Riva Tuner statistics servers though, just to be sure. CS2 plays fine with cards from the entry and mid-level of the GCN family. The R9 280 should play just fine, and the results we captured confirms this. 125 FPS on average at 1080 resolution and low settings. The map I played is DA Dust 2 and the 1% low stayed in the low 60s. 720 resolution will increase the FPS due to halving the pixel count, but the FPS does not double, but rather increases by about 20% for the average, and by pretty much nothing for the 1% lows. This is a sign of an approaching CPU bottleneck. I had to scrap my plans of using a saved match replay for Dota 2. The game refused to load it, so I ended up watching a live match instead, and at 1080 resolution and low settings, the card averaged 87 FPS and produced a 1% lows figure in the mid-40s. Fortnite, again, not the same replay. The game decided to ditch my replay, labeling it as invalid. I joined the match, and at 1080 resolution, performance rendering and the draw distance set to far, the card averaged a little over 120 FPS. The 1% lows were not particularly great this time around at just 28. Lowering the resolution will bring this latter number up, reaching 80 FPS at 720 resolution. As for the average, that one did not double, despite halving the pixel count. Instead, it settled around 145 FPS. Overwatch 2, along with Valorant, is one of the games that allow older GPUs to still get some use today. At 1080 resolution and low settings, the R9 to 80 ran at 185 FPS with 1% lows north of 140. While I did gather performance numbers for the lower resolutions, there's really no need to drop from 1080. For completeness sake, however, we can safely say that halving the pixel count, that's a fancy way of saying 720 resolution, so halving the pixel count doubles the FPS. A free game that runs well on potato GPUs, never mind the R9s. What's not to like about it? Rocket League will run just fine on the R9 to 80, at the usual 1080 resolution and low settings. At 214 FPS on average, it will be your own skills and the 1% lows that will make the difference between a win and a loss. And with the latter reaching 102 FPS, that leaves that to just, yeah. Splitgate also runs fine at 137 FPS for 1080 resolution and low settings. The 1% lows of almost 90 is also adequate for this game. Dropping the resolution to 720 is therefore done for a purely academic reason. The R9 to 80 averaged just shy of 200 FPS, and the 1% lows increased to just 118. Valorant is anything but GPU intensive at low settings and 1080 resolution, so to no surprise the R9 to 80 averaged just a bit less than 260 FPS, and the 1% lows at about 110. If you watched the previous review, then these numbers might feel familiar to you. And if a slower GPU provides the same results, this means just one thing: a platform-related bottleneck. I already recorded the run for Genshin Impact, so we're still showing results for this game, captured at the same 1080 resolution and low settings. Just like the review for the 270, we're still running an R9, which is fast enough for the settings mentioned before, so we're hitting the 60 FPS cap on average. The 1% lows of 50 is also adequate for this title. Out of curiosity, I increased the resolution to 1440 and got the same results, almost. The 2 extra FPS for the 1% lows are well within errors or variance inherent with not using a standardized benchmark. Next up is the HiRez Studio trio: Paladins, Realm, Royale and Rogue Company. All three of them ran at 1080 resolution and provided the following results. Paladins ran at 162 FPS on average, with 91 for the 1% lows at mostly high settings. Realm Royale, 146 FPS on average and 49 FPS for the 1% lows, also at higher settings. And the Rogue Company, 130 FPS on average with 1% lows of 73 FPS at low settings. Apparently, I'm only as good as level 5 in World of Tanks Blitz, since I now have a mix of wins and losses. And while the game can be demanding on the player, it is quite forgiving on the hardware. The R9 to 80 has no problem reaching the 60 FPS cap on average at 1080 resolution and low settings, and with the 1% lows at 58, the game experience is quite nice. If you're good at it, that is. I found these settings that allowed me to play Warframe without the co-op element. And at 1080 resolution and low settings, my typical run through the Mariana Grenier base has the R9 to 80 average 190 FPS. The 1% lows of 130 is so much better than what I got with the co-op experience, if you ask me. Or maybe I'm just a bit antisocial. I was curious to see how RE4 Remake would run on this older card. As all GCN 1 cards, it only supports DirectX features up to 11.1, and my previous tests with the R7 265 were not that encouraging. 720 resolution and low settings has the R9 to 80 average 46 FPS with 1% lows of 22. That's not that impressive though. The R7 to 60X scored about 7 FPS less on average, but 6 more for the 1% lows. I hope I'll be able to keep the R9 to 80 working for quite a few years to come. But the performance it delivers is only a part of the reason, and it gets smaller and smaller as time passes on. The other reason is, well, it's a GPU that stayed in the family, sort of, and that probably has me seeing it through rose-tinted glasses. I'd avoid getting this GPU for the prices I see in my local market. 40 USD is probably the maximum you should consider paying for one. While it will allow you to play all of the esports type of titles at 1080 resolution, it does suffer from lack of driver support. And while lack of DirectX 12 feature support was not much of a problem for RE4, it is apparently a must for other games. Fortunately, the next GPU up for review does have DirectX 12 support. Make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss when its 2023 review comes up. As for this video, well, we're done. I hope you liked it, and I'll see you for